The solitary rental house sat in profound isolation at the absolute edge of a small, quiet town, completely obscured by a dense, suffocating perimeter of overgrown pine trees. Positioned at the very end of a dark, unlit, dead-end street, the single-story residence offered a level of privacy that bordered on total segregation from the rest of the neighborhood. The young man who lived there worked exclusively from home as a freelance graphic designer, and he had grown deeply accustomed to the perpetual silence and the absolute lack of unexpected visitors. His daily routine was predictable and secure, heavily insulated from the outside world. It was a late, miserable Thursday evening in the middle of autumn, and a heavy, relentless rain was violently drumming against the old asphalt shingle roof and washing down the dark window panes. The designer was comfortable in his warm living room, entirely absorbed in the ambient glow of his television, when his peaceful solitude was abruptly shattered. Piercing through the rhythmic white noise of the storm were four distinct, incredibly heavy and authoritative knocks on the wooden front door. The sudden noise was highly unusual. His friends always texted well before dropping by, and no legitimate business operated at this late hour in such terrible weather. A cold spike of confusion and mild apprehension shot through his chest. He muted the television, plunging the room into a tense, expectant silence, and waited for a few seconds to see if he had merely imagined the sound. When two more firm, deliberate knocks echoed through the hallway, he reluctantly pushed himself off the couch and approached the entryway. Leaning forward, he pressed his eye against the small, scratched glass of the brass peephole. Standing on the small, dimly lit front porch was an unfamiliar man who appeared to be in his mid-30s. The stranger was dressed entirely in dark, practical clothing, wearing a heavy, water-resistant jacket and a dark baseball cap pulled aggressively low over his forehead, effectively casting his eyes into deep shadow. In his hands, he held a completely unmarked, medium-sized corrugated cardboard box. Assuming it was a delayed or misplaced postal delivery, the homeowner cautiously unlocked the deadbolt and opened the heavy wooden door just a few inches, making absolutely certain to keep the thick metal security chain firmly engaged in its track. A blast of freezing, damp night air immediately swept into the warm hallway. Without offering any standard greeting or polite apology for the late hour, the stranger stated in a flat, mechanical, and entirely emotionless voice that he had a delivery that strictly required a physical signature. He held up a small, glowing handheld electronic device and read aloud a recipient name. The name was completely foreign, bearing absolutely no resemblance to the homeowner or anyone who had previously rented the property. However, when the young man firmly stated through the narrow crack in the door that the courier had the wrong house, the stranger did not immediately apologize or turn to leave. Instead, the man slowly looked down at the soggy cardboard box in his hands, then at the glowing screen of his device, and finally read the printed address out loud. The street name and house number were absolutely perfectly accurate. The homeowner reiterated with growing firmness that no one by that specific name lived there and firmly refused to sign for an unknown parcel. What followed was a deeply unsettling violation of normal social behavior. The stranger did not break eye contact. He simply stood there in the freezing rain, staring directly through the narrow gap in the door with a cold, unblinking intensity that lasted several agonizing seconds longer than any normal human interaction dictated. The prolonged, silent scrutiny felt heavy, calculating, and predatory. Finally, without a single word of apology or acknowledgement, the man slowly stated that he must have been given incorrect dispatch information and would return the package to his truck. He turned his back and began walking down the wet concrete driveway. The young man quickly pushed the door shut, engaging the deadbolt and the handle lock with shaking hands.
Driven by a sudden, creeping paranoia, he immediately moved into the darkened dining room and carefully separated the plastic window blinds to watch the courier depart. His stomach dropped into a sickening knot of pure dread. He watched the dark figure walk past the mailbox and continue down the empty, rain-slicked street, eventually disappearing entirely into the gloomy shadows at the corner. There were no sweeping headlights, no sound of an idling engine, no glowing taillights, and absolutely no delivery van parked anywhere in sight. The man had simply walked out of the rainy darkness on foot, and he had returned directly into it.
The creeping paranoia from the previous evening had barely begun to subside when the second night arrived, bringing with it a profound and terrifying validation of the young man's fears. The designer had spent the entire day trying to rationalize the bizarre encounter, desperately convincing himself it was merely an incompetent, overworked delivery driver making a highly unprofessional mistake. However, as the digital clock in the living room clicked precisely to 8:45, the heavy, suffocating silence of the isolated house was shattered once again. Exactly as before, 4 distinct, firm, and authoritative knocks pounded against the solid wood of the front door. A paralyzing jolt of pure adrenaline flooded the homeowner's system, freezing him in his chair. He did not cautiously open the door as he had the night before. Instead, he crept silently down the hallway, keeping his footsteps impossibly light on the hardwood floor, and pressed his trembling face against the cold brass of the peephole. Staring back at him through the distorted fisheye lens was the exact same stranger. The man was wearing the identical dark, weather-resistant jacket and the same baseball cap pulled aggressively low to obscure his features. In his hands, he held the very same unmarked, slightly damp cardboard box. Refusing to unlock the deadbolt or even touch the metal security chain, the young man simply raised his voice, projecting loudly and firmly through the thick wooden barrier. He stated in unequivocal terms that the courier had returned to the wrong address, that the requested recipient did not reside there, and that he needed to leave the property immediately. He fully expected the stranger to apologize, turn around, and finally walk away into the damp night. Instead, the man outside exhibited a deeply unsettling and unnatural reaction. He did not speak a single word in response, nor did he immediately retreat. He slowly lowered the cardboard box to his side and took 2 deliberate steps backward, stopping at the very edge of the concrete porch. Standing in the pale, weak glow of the exterior light, the stranger began to slowly and methodically turn his head, scanning the exterior of the house. He stared intensely at the darkened living room windows, traced the structural lines of the facade, and examined the dark, narrow pathways leading to the side and rear of the property. His movements were calculated, rigid, and deeply predatory, looking exactly like a burglar meticulously assessing the physical vulnerabilities of a target before planning a forced entry. After a long, agonizing minute of this silent evaluation, the man finally turned and walked down the driveway, disappearing into the pitch-black street without the slightest sound of an approaching or departing vehicle. By the time the 4th night descended upon the isolated neighborhood, the situation deteriorated rapidly, escalating from a deeply unnerving nuisance into a genuine, life-threatening crisis. The homeowner was standing in the dimly lit kitchen around 9 o'clock, attempting to wash dishes and maintain some fragile semblance of a normal routine. Suddenly, a sound echoed through the house that made his blood run entirely cold. It was not the heavy, muffled thud of knuckles against the solid wooden front door. It was the sharp, highly distinct and incredibly close sound of knuckles rapping forcefully against the thin, fragile glass of the dining room window, located on the dark, blind side of the house. The young man completely froze, the running tap water masking the sound of his own sharply drawn breath. He sank slowly into a crouched position in the shadows, his eyes wide with terror as he stared toward the dining room. There was absolutely no legitimate reason for anyone to bypass the front porch and navigate the dark, overgrown side yard to knock directly on a residential window. The homeowner remained paralyzed in the dark for what felt like an eternity, listening intently to the oppressive silence of the property. Just as he began to hope the intruder had moved on, the heavy, familiar 4 knocks suddenly pounded against the front door. Gathering every ounce of his remaining courage, the young man crept silently back into the main hallway and peered through the peephole one more time. The stranger was standing on the porch again, but a horrifying detail immediately registered in the homeowner's mind. The man was no longer holding the cardboard box. His hands were completely empty, hanging loosely at his sides. The harmless prop of a misplaced delivery had been entirely discarded. As if sensing the presence on the other side of the wood, the stranger took a slow step forward and tilted his head up, looking directly and intensely into the tiny glass lens of the peephole. The designer stumbled backward in sheer panic, desperately trying to mask any sound of his movement, waiting in agonizing suspense as the man lingered on the porch for another 30 seconds before finally turning away. Refusing to turn on a single light, the homeowner waited 5 full minutes until the crunching footsteps completely faded away. He then began a slow, terrifying patrol of his own home, moving like a ghost through the dark rooms to verify that every lock was secured. When he reached the front living room, he carefully parted the plastic window blinds by a fraction of an inch, peering out into the gloomy, moonlit street. His breath completely caught in his throat. The stranger had not left the neighborhood. He was standing directly across the dead-end street, positioned at the absolute edge of the dark, dense tree line where the pavement ended and the deep forest began. The man was standing perfectly still, enveloped in the heavy shadows of the ancient pines, his face pointed directly at the house. He was not approaching, and he was not leaving. He was simply standing there in the freezing night, an unmoving, silent sentinel, watching the house with a terrifying, unfathomable patience.
Thoroughly terrified and mentally exhausted by the relentless nocturnal stalking, the young homeowner finally sought official intervention during the safety of the daylight hours. He contacted the local police non-emergency line, detailing the bizarre sequence of events, the fake package, and the chilling presence of the silent man standing at the edge of the forest. The officer on the other end of the line listened carefully before offering a deeply disturbing professional assessment. He explained that the situation sounded exactly like a methodical casing operation. Experienced burglars and home invaders frequently utilize the fake delivery tactic to verify a target's daily schedule and establish a pattern of occupancy. By knocking repeatedly over several nights, the intruder was testing to see if the house was ever left empty, measuring response times and mapping the interior layout based on which lights were turned on. The dispatcher strongly advised the designer to install exterior security cameras if possible, and gave him strict, unequivocal instructions to dial emergency services the absolute second the stranger returned to the property. Armed with this terrifying new context, the homeowner drastically altered his routine as the fifth night rapidly approached. Hoping to break the established pattern and simulate an empty residence, he moved through the house just after dusk, systematically turning off every single lamp, overhead fixture, and glowing appliance. The isolated property was plunged into total oppressive darkness, blending seamlessly with the shadows of the surrounding trees. He then retreated to his master bedroom at the end of the hall, securely locking the solid wooden door and sitting rigidly on the edge of his mattress. He held his charged cellular phone tightly in his sweating palms, staring blindly into the pitch-black room, and waited in agonizing suspense for the clock to strike the familiar hour. Right on schedule, cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence of the dark house, came the inevitable sound. 4 heavy, deliberate knocks struck the front door with terrifying precision. The young man held his breath, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He did not move a single muscle, refusing to approach the hallway or look through the peephole. He forced himself to remain absolutely silent, projecting the complete illusion that the house was entirely vacant. Following the initial knocks, a long, agonizing stretch of dead silence fell over the property. Several tense minutes crawled by, and the designer began to desperately hope that the intruder had accepted the illusion and finally walked away from the seemingly abandoned home. This fragile hope was violently shattered by a sudden, sickening sound emanating from the completely blind side of the property. A dull, heavy thud echoed from the enclosed backyard, pressing directly against the exterior wall of the kitchen. It was followed by the distinct, terrifying squeak of weight being applied to the old wooden steps of the back porch. The intruder had not left the neighborhood. He had simply bypassed the illuminated front street and moved under the cover of total darkness to the most vulnerable access point of the house. Sitting frozen in his bedroom, the homeowner listened in absolute horror as the brass doorknob of the rear exterior door began to turn. The mechanism twisted slowly, stopping as it hit the locked deadbolt, and then twisted again with far more aggressive force. When the locked door refused to yield, the situation escalated from a silent test of occupancy to a highly aggressive, forced home invasion. The terrifying, unmistakable sound of heavy metal scraping violently against dry wood echoed through the dark kitchen. The intruder had wedged a crowbar or a heavy pry tool directly into the doorframe, using immense physical leverage in a desperate attempt to violently snap the deadbolt out of its metal casing. Shaking uncontrollably, the young man immediately dialed the emergency number, pressing the phone to his ear and whispering in sheer terror to the dispatcher that someone was actively breaking into his home. He sat trapped in the dark bedroom, listening to the rhythmic, brutal splintering of wood as the dispatcher assured him that multiple patrol vehicles were speeding toward his exact location. The agonizing sounds of the attempted breach continued for 2 eternal minutes before abruptly and completely ceasing. The heavy, oppressive silence returned just as suddenly as the violence had begun. Moments later, the sweeping, blinding flashes of red and blue police lights completely flooded the dead-end street, casting wild shadows against the bedroom walls. The homeowner remained locked in his room until officially armed officers cleared the interior of the house and knocked on his bedroom door. Upon inspecting the exterior of the property, the patrol officers found no trace of the dark-clad stranger in the surrounding woods. However, illuminated under the harsh beams of their heavy tactical flashlights, the terrifying reality of the threat was undeniable. The wooden frame of the back door was severely splintered and deeply gouged, and the metal strike plate of the deadbolt was heavily scratched and partially bent outward. The intruder had been mere seconds away from successfully breaching the home before the distant wail of approaching sirens forced him to vanish completely back into the black, suffocating depths of the forest. Following the terrifying attempted break-in, several agonizingly tense days dragged by without incident, leaving the homeowner in a state of perpetual, exhausting hypervigilance. The heavy autumn rains eventually transitioned into a brutal, unseasonal winter storm that violently descended upon the region. A massive blizzard effectively severed the dead-end street from the rest of the small town, burying the asphalt under several feet of dense, heavy snow and rendering the narrow access road entirely impassable to any standard vehicle. The ambient temperature plummeted well below freezing, coating the exterior windows in thick, opaque layers of frost that completely blocked out the weak streetlights. The relentless, blinding snowfall rapidly erased any tire tracks, footprints, or visual evidence of the outside world, plunging the isolated rental house into an absolute ringing silence. The oppressive weight of the extreme weather trapped the young designer inside his home, entirely cutting off any realistic hope of a quick police response or physical escape should the stranger return. The psychological toll of the profound physical isolation rapidly compounded his existing trauma. The young man existed in a state of severe nervous exhaustion, his sleep cycles completely destroyed by the constant, primal fear of the dark-clad stalker coming back to finish the job. He spent his days pacing the dimly lit rooms, jumping violently at every innocuous groan of the settling foundation and every sudden gust of wind rattling the frozen window panes. The old house seemed to maliciously magnify his paranoia, echoing with phantom knocks and imagined scraping sounds that kept his adrenaline constantly surging. He locked every deadbolt, checked every window latch dozens of times a day, and kept his cellular phone constantly clutched in his sweating hand, desperately waiting for the weather to clear so he could finally abandon the property. Deep in the middle of a freezing, pitch-black night, the violent howling of the blizzard outside finally began to subside, leaving behind a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed painfully against the eardrums. The homeowner was lying fully clothed on top of his mattress, trapped in a shallow, restless state of half-sleep, when a new, profoundly terrifying sound jolted him completely awake. It was not the familiar, aggressive pounding on an exterior door, nor was it the heavy scraping of a metal crowbar against outside wood. It was a subtle, distinct, and undeniable sound that made the blood freeze completely solid in his veins. It was the slow, confident creak of the hardwood floorboards pressing down under immense physical weight directly inside the main hallway. The horrifying realization that the physical perimeter of the home had already been breached and the intruder was currently standing inside the house paralyzed the young man with an absolute, suffocating terror. He had completely missed the sound of the forced entry over the roaring wind of the dying storm. He lay perfectly rigid on his bed in the dark room, desperately holding his breath to prevent the sound of his own terrified panting from echoing through the drywall. Straining his ears against the dead silence of the insulated house, he listened to the terrifying auditory progression of the home invasion. Heavy, methodical footsteps, muffled slightly by wet, snow-covered winter boots, began to slowly navigate the interior space. The intruder was not rushing to grab valuables. The calculated footfalls moved with a sickening, predatory patience, pausing frequently as the unseen man systematically checked the layout of the home. The homeowner listened in agonizing horror as the brass handle of the spare bathroom slowly turned, followed by the quiet creak of the guest bedroom door swinging open on its old hinges. The intruder lingered in each empty space just long enough to verify it was unoccupied. Then the heavy, wet footsteps resumed their slow, rhythmic march down the hallway wood. The terrifying sounds bypassed the empty rooms one by one, moving inexorably, confidently, and steadily toward the final closed door of the master bedroom, where the terrified designer lay, hiding in the dark. With the heavy footsteps pausing directly outside his bedroom, the terrifying reality of his trapped situation washed over the young man. The master bedroom offered absolutely no safe avenues for retreat. The single window was securely locked and completely frozen shut by the severe winter storm, effectively sealing him inside a dark and inescapable dead end. Driven entirely by a primal, desperate instinct to survive, the homeowner silently slid off his mattress and frantically searched the pitch-black room for anything that could be used as a defensive weapon. His trembling fingers brushed against the top of his wooden dresser, firmly grasping the cold, solid base of a heavy metal decorative statue. Gripping the improvised bludgeon tightly against his chest, he pressed his back flat against the cold, dry wall, wedging himself deeply into the darkest, tightest corner immediately adjacent to the interior hinges of the bedroom door. He held his breath until his lungs burned, waiting in agonizing suspense as the brass doorknob slowly and deliberately began to turn downward. The internal latch clicked loudly in the oppressive silence, and the heavy wooden door was pushed open. A towering, imposing, dark silhouette stepped silently over the threshold, completely blocking the only exit. A massive, explosive surge of pure adrenaline immediately overrode the homeowner's paralyzing terror, forcing his body into rapid, violent action. Rather than waiting to be discovered in the shadows or attempting a physical strike with the heavy statue, he lunged forward with every ounce of his bodily strength and slammed both of his hands against the flat surface of the open door. He forcefully drove the solid wood back toward the doorframe with brutal momentum. A sickening, wet crunch echoed through the room as the heavy edge of the door smashed violently directly into the center of the unseen intruder's face. The massive figure stumbled backward into the hallway, momentarily stunned and thrown off balance by the unexpected physical retaliation. Seizing this single fleeting opportunity, the young man squeezed frantically past the disoriented attacker, dropping his improvised metal weapon to the floor and launching himself into a blind, desperate sprint down the dark, narrow corridor toward the front entryway. The momentary silence was instantly shattered by a deep, guttural roar of pure agony and immense rage erupting from the hallway behind him. The heavy, thundering footsteps of the large man immediately recovered their footing and began a violent, crashing pursuit through the dark house. The designer scrambled frantically into the front foyer, his hand slipping clumsily over the metal surface of the front door lock. He ripped the heavy wooden door open and threw his body forward, tumbling awkwardly out onto the freezing, snow-covered concrete of the front porch. The biting winter air hit his lungs like sharp needles, but the immediate relief of escaping the claustrophobic interior was entirely short-lived. The heavy front door did not remain open behind him. The massive intruder violently slammed the door shut the exact second the homeowner cleared the threshold. An instant later, the distinct, terrifying metallic click of the interior deadbolt sliding firmly into place echoed across the frozen porch. The predator had purposefully locked his victim out in the deadly winter storm, effectively claiming total ownership of the isolated house from the inside.
as the young man stood freezing and completely defenseless in the deep snow, desperately trying to comprehend the bizarre reversal of his situation. A deafening explosion of breaking glass violently shattered the silent night. The large, adjacent living room window blew outward with tremendous force, sending a chaotic shower of jagged, glittering shards raining down onto the frozen flower beds. Thrusting violently through the empty, jagged frame of the broken window was the horrifying, unmistakable face of the fake night courier. The stranger's features were heavily smeared with dark, fresh blood, pouring freely from a severely broken nose, but his expression was completely devoid of normal human pain. Instead, his face was contorted into a deeply disturbed, manic grimace, his lips pulled back, while his impossibly wide, unblinking, saucer-like eyes stared with pure, unadulterated madness directly at his escaping prey.
The deafening explosion of the shattered living room window finally broke the unnatural, suffocating isolation of the dead-end street. The violent noise, coupled with the raw, frantic screams of the freezing homeowners standing defensively in the snow, finally penetrated the heavy winter walls of the neighboring properties situated further down the dark road. Exterior porch lights began to rapidly flick on one by one, piercing the dense blizzard, and multiple frantic calls from alarmed neighbors were immediately dispatched to emergency services. Inside the besieged house, the manic, bleeding intruder suddenly froze in his tracks. The faint, high-pitched wail of approaching police sirens began to cut sharply through the howling wind, echoing menacingly across the desolate neighborhood. Realizing his meticulously calculated trap had catastrophically failed and his operational window had closed, the man instantly abandoned his psychological torment and his pursuit. He tore clumsily back through the dark house toward the rear exit, violently smashing the remaining glass of the back window with his heavy boots to create an immediate escape route, and vaulted recklessly out into the freezing, pitch-black forest. However, the very same severe winter storm that he had maliciously relied upon to isolate his victim and mask his approach now proved to be his ultimate, inescapable undoing. The thick, pristine blanket of freshly fallen snow covering the entire landscape perfectly captured his frantic, desperate flight. When multiple heavily armed police units arrived on the chaotic scene just minutes later, their sweeping, high-powered tactical flashlights immediately illuminated a flawless, undeniable tracking path leading directly away from the shattered rear window of the rental property. Sinking incredibly deep into the frozen drifts were massive, chaotic boot prints. More damningly, the white snow was heavily and consistently speckled with bright, fresh arterial blood, leaking rapidly from the severe, deep lacerations the man had sustained while violently forcing his upper body and arms through the jagged, broken window panes. The subsequent tactical tracking operation was swift and entirely one-sided. Following the macabre crimson trail deep into the frozen, unforgiving woods, the officers did not have to search for very long. Barely half a mile from the edge of the property, the bloody tracks terminated abruptly near a rusted, long-abandoned community playground swallowed by the trees. Slumped heavily against the frozen metal base of a dilapidated children's slide lay the dark-clad stranger. He was completely unconscious and entirely unresponsive, his body having succumbed rapidly to a combination of the extreme sub-zero winter temperatures and profound physical shock from massive blood loss. The subsequent tactical tracking operation was swift and entirely one-sided. Following the macabre crimson trail deep into the frozen, unforgiving woods, the officers did not have to search for very long. Barely half a mile from the edge of the property, the bloody tracks terminated abruptly near a rusted, long-abandoned community playground swallowed by the trees. Slumped heavily against the frozen metal base of a dilapidated children's slide lay the dark-clad stranger. He was completely unconscious and entirely unresponsive, his body having succumbed rapidly to a combination of the extreme sub-zero winter temperatures and profound physical shock from massive blood loss. The subsequent tactical search operation was swift and entirely one-sided. Following the macabre crimson trail deep into the frozen, unforgiving woods,
the officers did not have to search for very long. Barely half a mile from the edge of the property, the bloody tracks terminated abruptly near a rusted, long-abandoned community playground swallowed by the trees. Slumped heavily against the frozen metal base of a dilapidated children's slide lay the dark-clad stranger. He was completely unconscious and entirely unresponsive, his body having succumbed rapidly to a combination of the extreme sub-zero winter temperatures and profound physical shock from massive blood loss. The subsequent tactical search operation was swift and entirely one-sided. Following the macabre crimson trail deep into the frozen, unforgiving woods, the officers did not have to search for very long. Barely half a mile from the edge of the property, the bloody tracks terminated abruptly near a rusted, long-abandoned community playground swallowed by the trees. Slumped heavily against the frozen metal base of a dilapidated children's slide lay the dark-clad stranger. He was completely unconscious and entirely unresponsive, his body having succumbed rapidly to a combination of the extreme sub-zero winter temperatures and profound physical shock from massive blood loss. The subsequent tactical search operation was swift and entirely one-sided.